Close your eyes, take a slow breath in, and let it go. Imagine yourself in a world both familiar and distant, a place where fortunes rise and fall with the subtle click of a mouse, where digital dreams take flight, only to crash back to the earth in a storm of zeros and ones. In the first week of May 2022, something unprecedented unfolded in this vast virtual landscape. It wasn't a hack, a government intervention, nor a conventional market downturn. Instead, it was something altogether more surreal, more chilling in its quiet devastation. A currency, a digital asset trusted by millions, valued at tens of billions of dollars, simply ceased to exist. In the span of just 7 days, $40 billion evaporated from the digital ether. Not stolen, not hidden, not even lost in transit, just gone, vanished, as if the electronic impulses that brought it into being had never fired at all. At the heart of this seismic rupture stood a man, young and ambitious, with a mind forged in the halls of Stanford University. Kwon, 30 years old, had once held $1 billion fortune in his hands and an unshakable conviction that he had solved one of modern finance's knottiest problems. This is his story. Kwon was not merely a bystander in this digital cataclysm. He was its architect, its prophet, and ultimately its most tragic casualty. His vision was nothing less than revolutionary. A monetary system liberated from the chains of traditional banking, powered by a decentralized network, and governed by the elegant dance of algorithms. Terra was the name of this audacious vision, a stablecoin that promised to bridge the chasm between digital currencies and real-world usability, pegged to the stability of the US dollar. And Luna, its companion, was to be the counterweight, a cryptocurrency designed to absorb the shocks of market fluctuations. In Seoul, where Kwon was born in 1991, the digital future felt immediate and tangible. Technology seeped into the fabric of daily life, offering connectivity and innovation. It was here that Kwon's journey began, a path that would lead him across the globe to the storied halls of Stanford University, where he studied computer science. It was in Stanford's classrooms that Kwon's ideas began to take shape, nurtured by a community fueled by ambition and a belief in the transformative power of technology. In 2018, together with Daniel Shin, Kwon co-founded Terraform Labs. Their venture sought to redefine the financial systems that had become entrenched and often exclusionary. At its core was a promise of democratization, offering anyone with a smartphone the ability to engage with a financial network designed to be as inclusive as it was innovative. The concept of a stablecoin, pegged to the dependable value of the US dollar, was both radical and reassuring. It was an invitation to a new era of economic stability amid the wild seas of cryptocurrency volatility. As Terra and Luna began to gain traction, they drew the attention of investors from both sides of the Pacific. In Seoul, the tech-savvy populace saw in Terra the promise of a new financial order. In Silicon Valley, venture capitalists envisioned a future where the old financial norms could be reshaped by digital currencies, crafted intelligently and expertly. Yet, as Terra's value surged and the accolades began to pile up, there were those who harbored doubts. Whispers of skepticism about its algorithmic stability began to emerge. Could a digital currency truly maintain its value in the face of market forces as unpredictable as the wind? These questions loomed large, yet the momentum of success often drowned them out. Until that is, the start of May 2022, when optimism met an abrupt end, and a stunning collapse unfolded in real time. As we journey through this story, we uncover not just the fall of an enigmatic figure, but also the fragile dreams built on the shifting sands of innovation. Prepare yourself as we step into the first chapter of Kwon's remarkable tale, The Beginning. Prepare yourself as we step into the first chapter of Kwon's remarkable tale, The Beginning. The story opens in Seoul, South Korea, where the landscape of bustling streets and historic palaces cradled the early years of Kwon, born in 1991. His childhood unfolded in a rapidly modernizing city, a place where tradition met technology and where innovation thrived. It was here that young Kwon cultivated his interest in the burgeoning world of technology, a passion that would later shape his destiny. In the early 2000s, South Korea emerged as a global leader in internet broadband, which provided a fertile ground for the technologically inclined youth like Do. His academic journey was marked by excellence, driven by a profound curiosity and an insatiable hunger for knowledge. Those who knew him during his formative years recall a young man not only gifted, but also deeply determined to make a mark on the world. Kwon's educational journey led him across the Pacific Ocean to Stanford University in California. Stanford, a hub of innovation and entrepreneurial spirit, became the perfect backdrop for Kwon's burgeoning ambitions. Enrolled in the prestigious computer science program, his cohort included some of the brightest minds, many of whom would go on to lead the technological revolutions of the 21st century. The time Kwon spent at Stanford was transformative. It was during these years, surrounded by Silicon Valley's culture of disruption and innovation, that he began to nurture his grand vision for the future. Conversations with peers and professors often revolved around technology's potential to reshape the world, sparking ideas that would later influence his ventures. In his senior year, Kwon co-authored a paper that hinted at his future pursuits. This work delved into the intricacies of blockchain technology, exploring its possibilities beyond conventional financial systems. It was here that Kwon first articulated his belief in the power of decentralization, a principle that would underpin his later endeavors. Graduating from Stanford, Kwon returned to his homeland in 2016, bringing with him a wealth of knowledge and an eagerness to innovate. South Korea's cryptocurrency landscape was, at the time, nascent yet filled with potential. Inspired by his experiences abroad, Kwon was determined to leverage blockchain technology to create solutions that would challenge existing financial paradigms. In 2018, alongside fellow entrepreneur Daniel Shin, Kwon co-founded Terra Labs in Seoul. Their shared vision was ambitious: to develop a decentralized financial ecosystem that could democratize access to financial services. Terra and its sister currency, Luna, were born from this vision. The innovative approach aimed to address the volatility often associated with cryptocurrencies, proposing a stablecoin pegged to the US dollar. Terraform Labs quickly became a beacon of innovation, attracting attention from both local and international investors. Kwon's charisma and confidence, coupled with his technical acumen, played a pivotal role in garnering support. He quickly became known as a visionary, his ability to articulate a compelling narrative about the future of finance resonating with many. Yet, Kwon's path was not without challenges. The road to realizing his vision was fraught with technical hurdles and regulatory uncertainties. South Korea's regulatory environment regarding cryptocurrencies was evolving, presenting a complex landscape for entrepreneurs like Kwon to navigate. Despite these challenges, his resolve only seemed to strengthen. The year 2020 marked a significant milestone for Terra as it began to gain traction. Investors started to pour in, drawn by the promise of stability and innovation in the volatile crypto market. The potential for Terra's adoption was apparent as it sought to bridge the gap between traditional finance and decentralized systems, attracting both scrutiny and admiration. Kwon's leadership style was one of audacity and assurance. He often spoke of his belief in the transformative power of technology, not just as a tool for profit, but as a means to empower individuals and foster equality. This philosophy resonated deeply within the crypto community, aligning with the decentralized ethos that many held dear. As Terra's ecosystem expanded, so did the complexities associated with its management. The innovative algorithm that linked Terra and Luna was designed to maintain stability, a feature that was both revolutionary and contentious. Critics questioned the sustainability of such a mechanism, while supporters hailed it as the future of digital currency. In these early days, Kwon was not only building a company but also nurturing a movement. He envisioned Terra as part of a larger wave of change, one that could redefine economic systems and empower communities globally. His relentless pursuit of this vision drove Terraform Labs forward, attracting a diverse team of talented individuals who shared his passion. By 2021, Terra's presence was felt beyond South Korea, with its influence reaching into the heart of Silicon Valley. The platform's growth caught the attention of major investors, who saw in Terra the potential to challenge traditional financial institutions. It was a period of exhilarating growth, with Kwon at the helm, steering his creation into uncharted waters. However, underlying this success were the seeds of future challenges. As Terra's ecosystem grew, so too did the pressure to maintain its stability and integrity. Kwon's confidence was both his greatest asset and, unbeknownst to many, a potential Achilles heel. The coming years would test this balance, as the foundation he built would face unprecedented trials. Kwon's early journey was marked by dreams and determination, laying the groundwork for what was to come. It is a testament to the power of vision and the courage to pursue it against all odds. As we close this chapter, the stage is set for Terra's meteoric rise and the challenges that lay ahead. Join us in the next chapter as we explore vision and ambition, delving into the innovations that powered Terraform Labs and the grand designs that propelled Kwon onto the global stage. Kwon's vision for a decentralized financial network was ambitious and transformative. In 2018, he co-founded Terraform Labs with Daniel Shin, a fellow entrepreneur in the bustling city of Seoul. Their goal was to redefine currency, blending the certainty of the digital realm with the stability of traditional financial systems. The seeds of what would become Terra and Luna were planted in this dynamic partnership. At the heart of their innovation was Terra, a stablecoin designed to be pegged to the US dollar. This digital currency was intended to offer stability in the volatile world of cryptocurrencies. Luna, its sister coin, was crafted to absorb market fluctuations, preserving the stability of Terra. These innovations were not mere technological advances. They were promises of a new financial era. For Kwon, the vision extended beyond just currency. He dreamed of a financial network free from the constraints of traditional banking systems. A network where transactions were seamless, near instantaneous, and accessible to all. This ambitious vision was rooted in his formative years at Stanford University, where he studied computer science and soaked in the culture of innovation. Stanford, with its proximity to Silicon Valley, had a profound impact on him. There, amidst the whispers of entrepreneurial legends, he honed his technical skills and cultivated a mindset of disruption. He was part of a generation that saw technology as a force for democratization and empowerment. The energy of the campus, with its relentless drive towards the future, fueled his ambitions. Kwon's time at Stanford was marked by more than just academic pursuits. It was here that he forged connections with like-minded individuals who shared his passion for innovation. These relationships would later prove instrumental in building the network needed to launch Terraform Labs. He was laying the foundation for a future that promised to bridge the gap between the digital and the physical. The early days of Terraform Labs were characterized by a flurry of activity and experimentation. Based in Seoul, the team worked tirelessly to bring their vision to life. The city, with its blend of tradition and modernity, was the perfect backdrop for their bold venture. It was a place where innovation was not just welcomed, but celebrated. In 2019, just a year after its founding, Terraform Labs launched Terra on the mainnet. The response was immediate, and overwhelmingly positive. Investors and technologists alike were drawn to the promise of a stablecoin that could withstand the turbulent tides of the cryptocurrency market. It was hailed as a potential game changer, a beacon of stability in a sea of volatility. Terra's appeal was not limited to its technological promise. It also offered practical applications that resonated with users. One of the pioneering use cases was in e-commerce, where Terra was integrated into payment systems to reduce transaction costs. This real-world application underscored the coin's utility, further fueling its rise. As Terra and Luna gained traction, Kwon's reputation as a visionary leader grew. He was seen as a trailblazer, someone who dared to challenge the status quo. His confidence and charisma were infectious, drawing in followers and investors from across the globe. In Seoul, he was celebrated as a national hero of sorts, a figure leading the charge in the digital revolution. The momentum was palpable in Silicon Valley, too. Here, venture capitalists were eager to invest in what seemed like the next big thing in fintech. The promise of Terra and Luna was too tempting to resist. In 2020, Terraform Labs secured significant funding from top-tier investors, signaling its entry into the elite club of high-potential tech startups. This period was marked by a dizzying series of milestones. Partnerships were forged, and the ecosystem expanded rapidly. By 2021, Terra was integrated with dozens of blockchain projects, each adding to its utility and reach. Every new partnership was a step closer to realizing the grand vision of a decentralized financial network. However, the rapid rise was not without its challenges. The landscape of cryptocurrency is notoriously unpredictable, with regulatory hurdles and technical challenges lurking at every turn. For Kwon and his team, navigating these waters required not just innovation, but resilience and adaptability. Despite the obstacles, they pressed on, driven by the unwavering belief in their mission. As Terra continued to grow, skepticism began to surface. Some experts questioned the sustainability of Terra's algorithmic model. Concerns were raised about the long-term stability of a system that relied heavily on the interplay between Terra and Luna. These voices, though initially in the minority, highlighted the inherent risks of such an ambitious undertaking. Yet for many, these doubts were overshadowed by the excitement of possibility. The dream of a decentralized currency that could redefine the financial landscape was too compelling to dismiss. Investors continued to pour money into the project, buoyed by the promise of transformative returns. The allure of innovation and the potential for dramatic profits created a powerful momentum. As the calendar turned to 2022, anticipation was in the air. The Terra ecosystem was set to reach new heights, with plans for further expansion and integration. For Kwon, it seemed that the pieces of his grand vision were finally falling into place. But beneath the surface, currents of uncertainty were beginning to stir. The scene was set for an unprecedented chapter in the story of Terra. What had begun as a vision in the mind of a young innovator was on the verge of becoming a global phenomenon. Yet, as with all meteoric rises, the possibility of a fall loomed ever closer. The stage was prepared for a dramatic turn of events, one that would test the resilience of Kwon and his creation. In the coming months, Terra's journey would take an unexpected course. What lay ahead would challenge not just the technology, but the very ideals that had driven its creation. As the ecosystem expanded, the cracks that had been quietly forming would soon become impossible to ignore. And as May 2022 approached, the world watched with bated breath, unaware of the storm that was about to unfold. And as May 2022 approached, the world watched with bated breath, unaware of the storm that was about to unfold. Beneath the polished veneer of success, Terra was already showing signs of strain. The cracks in its foundation were not yet visible to the everyday investor, but for those with a discerning eye, the red flags were unmistakable. In the heart of Seoul, Analysts began whispering about Terra's algorithmic stability. To many, the whispered concerns seemed like nothing more than the usual skepticism that accompanied any groundbreaking technology. However, to those who understood the intricate dance of algorithms and markets, a gnawing unease had begun to take root. Kwon, the charismatic co-founder of Terraform Labs, stood resolute in the face of doubt. His confidence was unshakable, a trait that had become both his strength and his Achilles heel. At 30, Du had already achieved what many could only dream of. Born in 1991, his journey from the bustling streets of Seoul to the halls of Stanford University had been one of relentless ambition. In 2018, alongside Daniel Shin, Du founded Terraform Labs, envisioning a decentralized financial network that could redefine how the world perceived money. Terra was to be a stablecoin pegged to the US dollar, with Luna designed to absorb market fluctuations. This dual coin system was innovative, promising stability in a notoriously volatile market. The vision was compelling, and the world took notice. Investors from both Seoul and Silicon Valley flocked to Terra, drawn by the allure of a financial revolution. By late 2021, Terra's market cap soared and its ecosystem expanded rapidly. Yet, as the sun rose on 2022, shadows of doubt began to creep in. Experts raised concerns about the underlying mechanisms of Terra's stability. The algorithm that promised to maintain the peg was complex, yet not foolproof. Critics argued that in extreme market conditions, the system could falter. Such warnings were largely ignored, drowned out by the chorus of approval from those who saw only the potential for profit. In private meetings, Kwon remained undeterred. His public persona exuded confidence, a necessary veneer to maintain investor trust. Yet behind closed doors, the pressure was mounting. The stakes were high, not just financially, but personally, as he stood at the helm of a billion-dollar enterprise. As Terra continued to gain momentum, the cracks in its foundation widened. Behind the scenes, market volatility began testing the limits of its algorithm. The system strained under pressure, yet outwardly everything seemed under control. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. In April 2022, whispers turned into murmurs as more experts joined the chorus of concern. Among them was Alex Werner, a seasoned analyst known for his incisive critiques of cryptocurrency models. Alex published a detailed report highlighting potential vulnerabilities in Terra's algorithmic assumptions. This report gained traction in certain circles, sparking debates among crypto enthusiasts and skeptics alike. Despite the growing discourse, most investors remained optimistic, buoyed by Terra's previous successes and the charismatic assurances of its leader. By May 2022, the dissonance between public perception and underlying reality had reached a critical point. The algorithm, designed to weather market fluctuations, was about to face its greatest challenge yet. As the winds of volatility swept across the market, the stage was set for a dramatic unfolding. On May 7, 2022, Terra experienced the first tremors of what would become a financial earthquake. The peg that had been so carefully maintained began to slip. Luna, meant to stabilize this very scenario, struggled against the overwhelming tide of market forces. The digital realm watched in real time as Terra's value wavered. Investors, large and small, were caught in a whirlwind of uncertainty. The initial slips were minor, but in the world of cryptocurrencies, minor shifts could cascade into avalanches. By May 9th, the situation had escalated and panic began to settle in. Forums, once filled with optimism, now buzzed with anxiety and speculation. Kwon and his team scrambled to stabilize the situation. Behind closed doors, strategies were devised and redevised, each attempt seemingly in vain. The world outside could only watch as the value of Terra continued its downward spiral. For many investors, it was a gut-wrenching wait, hoping for a miracle that seemed increasingly unlikely. With every passing hour, the foundational cracks in Terra's system became increasingly apparent. The algorithmic solution that had once seemed so promising now appeared fragile. May 12th saw a further drop, the numbers on the screens reflecting the monumental loss of trust and capital. The $40 billion ecosystem was unraveling at an unprecedented pace. The financial markets, both crypto and traditional, felt the ripple effects of this collapse. Confidence, once abundant, was now a scarce commodity. As institutions and individual investors alike grappled with the fallout, the question loomed: what would become of the man behind the vision? Kwon's public appearances were marked by an air of determination, yet the weight of the crisis was palpable. Reports emerged of sleepless nights and relentless strategizing. For the first time, the seemingly invincible architect of Terra appeared vulnerable, a reminder of the human fragility behind technological grandiosity. In the midst of the chaos, the world began to reflect on the broader implications of such a monumental collapse. The allure of cryptocurrency had always been its promise of democratizing finance. Yet as Terra crumbled, the risks inherent in this uncharted territory became starkly evident. As May drew to a close, the magnitude of the loss became clear. An estimated $40 billion had vanished, leaving a trail of financial devastation and shattered dreams. For those who had believed in Terra and its promise, the reality was a bitter pill to swallow. The world watched as regulators and investors called for accountability and answers. In the aftermath of such a seismic event, the lessons learned would shape the future of the cryptocurrency landscape. And as the dust began to settle, all eyes turned once more to Kwon, waiting to see how he would navigate the turbulent waters ahead. The stage was set for what would become the next chapter in this unfolding saga. It was early 2022, and murmurs of concern had begun to ripple through the financial corridors of both Seoul and Silicon Valley. This unease stemmed from an increasing skepticism about the algorithmic underpinnings of Terra, the digital asset that had promised a financial revolution. On the surface, Terra's value proposition was compelling. It was designed as a stablecoin, pegged to the US dollar, offering the allure of stability within the volatile seas of cryptocurrency. Accompanying it was Luna, a complementary cryptocurrency intended to absorb fluctuations and maintain Terra's peg. Yet, as the months ticked by, whispers of fragility became harder to ignore. Economists and blockchain experts began to dissect Terra's model with a critical eye. The algorithm that linked Terra and Luna was sophisticated, but in its complexity lay potential pitfalls. Critics pointed out the reliance on Luna's value to maintain Terra's stability created a precarious balance. If Luna's value faltered, Terra's stability could unravel. Kwon, the charismatic 30-year-old at the helm, remained publicly unfazed. Kwon had always exuded an air of confidence, a trait he had carried since his days at Stanford University. His vision for a decentralized financial ecosystem was nothing short of ambitious, and for many, that ambition was intoxicating. However, as Terra's market capitalization soared, so too did the stakes. In March 2022, a high-profile conference in Singapore became the backdrop for heated debate. Experts gathered to discuss the future of decentralized finance, and Terra was a focal point. Among the attendees was Dr. Emily Chen, a blockchain researcher from MIT. Chen had been vocal about her concerns regarding algorithmic stablecoins, and she did not mince words. Addressing the audience, she warned, "The promise of stability in the crypto market is alluring but fraught with danger if not backed by robust fundamentals." The reaction was mixed. Some nodded in agreement, while others, captivated by Terra's rapid rise, dismissed her warnings as overly cautious. Yet beneath the surface, these doubts began to take root. By April, the skepticism reached a crescendo. Financial analysts at major investment firms started publishing reports that questioned the sustainability of Terra's model. Despite the mounting pressure, Terraform Labs remained bullish. On April 25, 2022, in a statement to investors, Kwon reiterated his commitment to the project. "Every transformative idea faces skepticism," he stated confidently. "We are on the cusp of something historic." His words were intended to reassure, but for some, they rang hollow against the backdrop of growing uncertainty. Amidst the financial discourse, the human stories of those invested in Terra began to emerge. In Seoul, Min Jae, a software engineer in his late 20s, had bet his savings on Terra's success. He had been drawn in by the promise of a decentralized future and the potential for financial independence. "It felt like the future," he later recalled, "like I was part of something bigger." Across the globe, in San Francisco, Laura Rodriguez, a young entrepreneur, had tied her startup's fortunes to Terra's ecosystem. The allure of incorporating blockchain technology into her business model was irresistible. Yet as April wore on, she found herself increasingly anxious. "Every day, I checked the news, wondering if I had made the right choice," she confessed. By early May, the tension was palpable. On May 7, 2022, Terra experienced a slight dip, a common occurrence in the volatile crypto market. However, this dip was different. It triggered a cascade of sell-offs. Luna's value began to plummet, and with it, the stability of Terra was put to the test. Within hours, billions were wiped from the market. For Kwon, this was the nightmare scenario. On May 8th, he convened an emergency meeting with key members of Terraform Labs. Among them was Daniel Shin, co-founder and trusted ally. The two had journeyed together since 2018, sharing a vision that now seemed to teeter on the brink. "We need to reassure our community," Shin urged, "show them we're still in control." But control was slipping. On May 9th, Terra's value continued to freefall. Panic spread as investors scrambled to salvage their holdings. It was a financial contagion, swift and devastating. The very algorithm designed to protect Terra now amplified its downfall, as Luna's value eroded faster than anyone had anticipated. The repercussions were immediate and profound. On May 10th, global markets took notice. In New York, stock traders watched as crypto-related stocks faltered. Among them, seasoned investor Michael Thompson reflected on the unfolding chaos. "I've seen bubbles burst," he observed, "but this was different. It was as if the air had suddenly been sucked out of the room." By May 11th, the domino effect reached traditional financial institutions. Banks and investment firms began reassessing their exposure to cryptocurrencies. The shockwaves extended beyond the financial sector, touching lives and livelihoods. For Min Jae in Seoul, the dream of financial independence had turned into a nightmare. "I felt lost," he admitted, "like everything I had worked for was slipping away." Laura Rodriguez, too, grappled with the fallout. Her startup, once buoyed by optimism, now faced harsh realities. "We've had to pivot," she explained, "to find new ways forward." The human cost of Terra's collapse was staggering, a testament to the interconnectedness of modern finance. Amidst the chaos, Kwon remained a focal point. Supporters and critics alike watched his every move, searching for signs of leadership or culpability. On May 12th, Kwon addressed the public via a live stream. His demeanor was somber, his words measured. "We are doing everything in our power to stabilize the situation," he assured. "This is not the end." Yet, for many, it felt like an ending. As May 13th dawned, Terra's value had all but evaporated, culminating in a total loss of $40 billion. The collapse was complete, leaving a trail of financial ruin in its wake. The world of cryptocurrency, once filled with boundless potential, now faced an existential reckoning. This chapter in the saga of Kwon and Terra was marked by ambition, innovation, and ultimately, hubris. As the dust settled, the question on everyone's mind was what would come next. The lessons of May 2022 were profound, and the repercussions were only beginning to be understood. The journey was far from over, and the stage was set for the next chapter. A chapter that would delve into Kwon's response to the crisis that had unfolded. How he would navigate the aftermath was yet to be seen. And so the story continued to unfold, with the world watching and waiting for what would come next. And so the story continued to unfold, with the world watching and waiting for what would come next. In May 2022, Terra's ecosystem faced a test unlike any it had encountered before. Within a week, the collapse of Terra and its associated cryptocurrency, Luna, erased $40 billion in value. Investors, once filled with optimism, now stared at their screens in disbelief. The timeline of this collapse reads like a financial thriller. It began on May 7th, when Terra's algorithmic stablecoin, UST, which was supposed to hold a steady value of $1, lost its peg. The depegging was subtle at first, just a few cents difference, but enough to spark panic. By May 9th, the whispers of doubt had turned into a cacophony. Investors rushed to exit, selling off their holdings in a frenzy that further destabilized the system. The underlying mechanism that was supposed to stabilize Terra failed to contain the damage. Luna, which was designed to absorb UST's fluctuations, began to plummet. As Luna's value cratered, the once ambitious digital project seemed to unravel at the seams. This wasn't just a market fluctuation, it was an unraveling of trust and technology. Kwon, the enigmatic founder of Terraform Labs, watched the events unfold, perhaps with a growing sense of helplessness. He was 30 years old then, facing the most significant professional crisis of his life, a crisis that would soon turn personal and existential. For Kwon, the world he had meticulously built was collapsing before his eyes. Born in Seoul in 1991, he had always been an individual driven by a vision that led him to Stanford University, where he honed his skills in computer science. It was here that his ambition took root. He dreamt of creating a decentralized financial network that could rival traditional banking systems. In 2018, along with Daniel Shin, he co-founded Terraform Labs, launching Terra and Luna with bold promises. The system was designed with the elegance of a self-balancing mechanism. Luna would act as a stabilizing force for UST, ensuring its value remained pegged to the US dollar. Yet, in the chaos of May 2022, this very design became its Achilles heel. As Luna's price spiraled downwards, questions about the algorithm's stability became more than academic. Financial institutions and retail investors alike were exposed to losses that many had not anticipated. The repercussions were not limited to financial losses alone. Entire communities of developers and entrepreneurs who had built projects on Terra found themselves in limbo. Lives and livelihoods were destabilized overnight, leaving a trail of confusion and uncertainty. The emotional weight of this collapse cannot be overstated. Stories of individuals losing their life savings filled social media. Some had invested not just money, but their confidence in a new era of financial innovation. The disillusionment was palpable. One such story was of Jiho Kim, a young developer from Busan. Jiho had left a stable job to work on a Terra-based project, believing in the promise of decentralization. The collapse left him questioning his choices and future. In the United States, investors like Sarah Dawson, a 45-year-old nurse from Ohio, saw her retirement savings decimated. She had been persuaded by the narratives of empowerment and innovation surrounding Terra. Now she faced an uncertain financial future. These personal stories highlight the human cost behind the numbers. They remind us that at the heart of financial systems are people with hopes and dreams. People who, in moments of crisis, are left grappling with loss and disbelief. As the days of May 2022 unfolded, the financial markets beyond Terra and Luna also felt the tremors. The broader cryptocurrency market, which had already been experiencing volatility, reacted sharply to Terra's downfall. Confidence eroded, pulling down the prices of other cryptocurrencies as well. For regulators and financial analysts, the collapse served as a cautionary tale. It highlighted the systemic risks posed by algorithmic stablecoins and the need for more robust regulatory frameworks. Discussions about oversight intensified across global financial hubs. In South Korea, the government initiated investigations into Terra Labs, scrutinizing the company's operations and financial practices. The media dubbed it a crypto-seismic event, causing waves throughout the tech and financial sectors. Through these turbulent days, Kwon maintained a public presence, occasionally taking to Twitter in attempts to reassure and explain. But his confident tone from previous months had shifted. The certainty that once characterized his communication was replaced by a more measured, albeit strained demeanor. Internally, Terra Labs was in crisis mode. Teams scrambled to find solutions, exploring every possible avenue to restore UST's peg and stabilize Luna. Yet the magnitude of the crisis was overwhelming. The mechanisms that were supposed to restore balance were now part of the problem. The complexity of modern financial systems, especially in the realm of cryptocurrencies, was laid bare for all to see. What had been hailed as the future of finance was now a stark reminder of the risks that come with innovation. The collapse of Terra and Luna in May 2022 will be remembered as a pivotal moment in the history of digital currencies. It marked a turning point, not just for those directly involved, but for the entire landscape of decentralized finance. In the aftermath, the world began to reflect on what this meant for the future. How could such a collapse be prevented in the future? What lessons could regulators and innovators learn? As the dust settled, the focus shifted back to Kwon. Was this the end of his journey, or merely a chapter in a larger story? For someone who had always looked forward, how would he now confront the past? Questions lingered, and accountability loomed on the horizon. The world was eager to understand, not just how such a failure had happened, but what could be done to rebuild trust. And so, a new chapter begins, where reflections on ambition and risk intersect with the relentless march of innovation. And so, a new chapter begins, where reflections on ambition and risk intersect with the relentless march of innovation. In the wake of Terra's collapse, the corridors of power and technology buzzed with questions. How could this have happened so quickly? What would become of Kwon, the once celebrated architect of a dream now shattered? For Kwon, May 2022 was a month that tested every facet of his being. Born in Seoul in 1991, Kwon was no stranger to challenges, but this was unprecedented. At just 30 years old, he faced an audience vastly different from those who had once cheered his innovations. Unlike the applause at Stanford, where he had honed his skills in computer science, the voices now were critical, demanding answers. Investors who had once poured funds into Terraform Labs, founded with Daniel Shin in 2018, were left reeling. With a staggering $40 billion lost in mere days, confidence was shattered as quickly as it had been built. Kwon's response was critical, watched by many who sought insight into his character. He was known for his assertive confidence, often bordering on bravado. As Luna, the cryptocurrency designed to stabilize Terra, spiraled into worthlessness, that very confidence seemed to waver. The algorithms that had once promised stability now lay bare their vulnerability. In the days following the collapse, Kwon took to social media, a platform where he had thrived in better times. His tweets, once filled with ambitious declarations, now turned to address the crisis. He stated on May 12, 2022, "I am heartbroken about the pain my invention has brought you all." The words were sincere, yet they did little to stem the tide of criticism. Across the globe in Seoul, where Terra had been hailed as a technological marvel, the mood was somber. Many locals had invested life savings, entrusting Kwon and his vision with their financial futures. The fallout was personal, striking at the core of communities that had placed their faith in a digital promise. In Silicon Valley, the birthplace of countless innovations, a different kind of reflection took place. Here, Terra had been a symbol of what technology could achieve when ambition knew no bounds. Yet now, it served as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the fine line between visionary and folly. Amidst these locales, Kwon began to navigate the storm he found himself in. He held meetings with his team, each gathering more solemn than the last. There were strategy sessions aimed at rebuilding, though the future seemed uncertain. The confidence that had once driven Terra's meteoric rise was now a double-edged sword. Kwon appeared before audiences, no longer the charismatic innovator, but a man grappling with the weight of his creation's failure. His statements were measured, focusing on accountability and the lessons learned. To some, he was an architect of collapse. To others, a symbol of innovation gone awry. Beyond the immediate fallout, the broader cryptocurrency community watched closely. The collapse of Terra sent ripples through an industry that prided itself on revolutionizing finance. Critics seized the moment to question the viability of algorithmic stablecoins, while proponents sought paths to redemption and resilience. The narrative of Terra's fall became intertwined with larger discussions about regulation and oversight. Governments, once hesitant to intervene in the rapidly evolving crypto space, now began to weigh the need for tighter controls. The stakes were clear. Protecting consumers and maintaining market stability required a new approach. As these debates unfolded, Kwon continued to address his role in the saga. In interviews, he admitted to underestimating certain risks, but maintained a belief in the potential for decentralization. His words resonated with those still committed to the ideals that had once buoyed Terra. Yet for many who had suffered losses, the path to trust was fraught with complexity. The emotional toll was heavy, as stories emerged of investors grappling with financial ruin. These were not just numbers on a ledger, but lives profoundly altered by a failed promise. The emotional weight of the collapse extended beyond finance. In Seoul, a city that had embraced the future with zeal, there was a palpable sense of betrayal. The dream of Korea leading in global innovation had dimmed, replaced by skepticism and caution. In reflecting on these events, Kwon stood at a crossroads. His journey from Stanford's halls to global notoriety had been swift and intense. Now he faced a future that required rebuilding not just a company, but trust itself. As Terra's ecosystem lay in disarray, Kwon's response would set the tone for what came next. Would he double down on innovation, learning from past missteps, or would he retreat, pondering the deeper lessons of ambition unchecked? The days turned into weeks, and the immediate crisis began to transition into a longer reflection. For Kwon, the path forward was as much about introspection as it was about action. He was determined to contribute to solutions that would prevent future collapses, aware of the delicate balance between risk and reward. The world of cryptocurrency continued to evolve, undeterred by Terra's fall, yet chastened by its stark lessons. In boardrooms and basements alike, innovators considered the implications of a failure so resounding. They questioned what the future would hold for a technology still in its nascent stages. As for Kwon, he remained a figure at the center of this unfolding narrative. His journey was far from over, defined not by a single event, but by the totality of his actions and responses. Each decision carried weight, as the implications of Terra's collapse rippled outward. In the quiet moments away from the public eye, Kwon pondered the very nature of ambition and progress. What lessons could be drawn from a venture that had soared so high, only to fall so dramatically? He knew that the answers would not come easily, but were essential to his own evolution. In this new chapter of his life, Kwon faced the daunting task of rebuilding. It was a time to reflect on past decisions, to understand their impact, and to chart a course for what lay ahead. The story of Terra and its architect was far from concluded. As the world watched, Many awaited the next chapter with anticipation, for it would surely bring revelations and insights. The journey of Kwon and the broader crypto landscape was a testament to the enduring dance between innovation and consequence. And so, as the dust settled, the world pondered what the next move in this unfolding saga would be. Moving forward, the lessons learned would shape not just the destiny of one man, but the very future of an industry poised on the precipice of change. The story of ambition, risk, and innovation continued to unfold, inviting us to look deeper into the heart of what drives us. The story of ambition, risk, and innovation continued to unfold, inviting us to look deeper into the heart of what drives us. In the aftermath of Terra's collapse, the once ambitious vision of Kwon lay in ruins. Investors, some left with nothing, grappled with the reality of their losses. Crypto enthusiasts, who had once lauded Terra as a beacon of financial revolution, were left questioning the very foundations of decentralized finance. For Kwon, the aftermath was a time of profound reflection. Born in Seoul in 1991, he had always been a figure who thrived on the edge of innovation. His journey from a bright student studying computer science at Stanford to the co-founder of Terraform Labs had been marked by a relentless drive to reshape financial systems. Yet, the events of May 2022 had cast a long shadow over these aspirations. The cryptocurrency community, vibrant and vocal, found itself at a crossroads. The collapse of Terra, a stablecoin pegged to the US dollar, and its counterpart Luna had sent shockwaves across digital economies. The $40 billion loss was not just a number. It was a testament to the volatility and risks inherent in the crypto world. Conversations in the corridors of tech hubs from Seoul to Silicon Valley turned somber, as the promise of boundless innovation now seemed fraught with unexpected peril. Amid the turmoil, stories of individual investors began to surface. People like Emily, a young professional from New York, who had poured her savings into Terra, believing it to be a secure investment. Her dreams of financial independence were shattered. She was left to ponder the allure of high returns versus the safety nets traditional investments might offer. It was a story repeated in countless variations around the world, each adding a layer of human cost to the financial disaster. The ripple effects of the collapse extended beyond the immediate economic impact. Regulators across different countries began scrutinizing the crypto industry with renewed vigor. The promise of decentralized finance was met with increased calls for oversight and regulation. As they navigated these uncharted waters, policymakers were challenged to balance innovation with the need for investor protection. Kwon, at the center of this storm, faced intense scrutiny. At 30 years old, he had been both celebrated and vilified. His confidence, once unshakable, now appeared more introspective. Public appearances were rare, and when they did occur, they were met with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. He was a man grappling with the weight of expectations and the reality of loss, both financial and reputational. As the dust began to settle, Terraform Labs underwent a period of re-evaluation. The team, which had once operated with the zeal of a startup destined to change the world, now faced the task of rebuilding trust. Internal discussions revolved around the fundamental question of what went wrong. Was it hubris, a failure of the algorithm, or simply the unpredictable nature of markets? In the broader landscape, the collapse served as a cautionary tale. It spurred deep discussions about the future of cryptocurrencies and the role of stablecoins in a volatile market. Experts weighed in, each adding their perspective to a complex puzzle. The debate touched on themes of stability, transparency, and the ethical responsibilities of those who create and promote financial products. Through it all, the human element remained central. People like Emily, who had to rebuild from scratch, found solace in community and shared experiences. Online forums and support groups became spaces for connection and healing. They exchanged stories, offered advice, and sometimes simply listened, finding comfort in not being alone. The world of finance, both traditional and digital, watched closely. The lessons from Terra's downfall were seen as pivotal in shaping the next phase of crypto evolution. Bankers, technologists, and investors alike understood that they were participants in an ongoing experiment with real-world consequences. Meanwhile, Kwon found himself at a crossroads. Would he retreat, reflecting on the path that led to this point, or would he emerge with new insights and ideas? His next steps were unknown, but they were the subject of much speculation. For those who had followed his journey, there was a sense of anticipation mixed with caution. The cryptocurrency landscape continued to evolve, influenced by both the failures and successes of the past. New projects emerged, each claiming to have learned from predecessors like Terra. Yet, the shadow of May 2022 remained a poignant reminder of volatility and risk. As Kwon contemplated his future, he carried with him the weight of history and the potential for redemption. His story, emblematic of ambition and innovation, was also a testament to the enduring complexity of human endeavor. The collapse, though devastating, offered lessons that would echo beyond the world of crypto. In this aftermath, a quiet resilience began to surface. People who had once been mere investors became educators and advocates. They shared their experiences, hoping to guide others away from similar pitfalls. The narrative of financial literacy gained traction, emphasizing the importance of understanding risks alongside rewards. The broader implications for technological innovation were profound. The dream of decentralized finance was still alive, but it was tempered by a new awareness of its challenges. Developers and entrepreneurs continued to push boundaries, inspired yet cautious, knowing that the line between success and failure was thin. As the chapter closed on this tumultuous period, the questions of what comes next lingered. For Kwon, for investors like Emily, and for the entire cryptocurrency community, the journey was far from over. The lessons learned in the aftermath were just the beginning, forming the foundation for what was yet to unfold. And so, the world waited on the brink of what could be a new beginning or another descent into chaos. The choices made in the coming days and months would determine the future of not just Terra, but the entire ecosystem it once aspired to revolutionize. With eyes set on the horizon, the stage was set for a new chapter in this ongoing saga. With eyes set on the horizon, the stage was set for a new chapter in this ongoing saga. The investigation into the collapse of Terra, once a beacon of financial innovation, was not merely a procedural necessity. It was a quest for understanding, a way to piece together the fragments of a dream that had turned into a nightmare. May 2022 had left a scar, not only on the financial landscape, but also on the lives of countless individuals. Investors who had once placed their faith in Terra's promise of stability and growth were now grappling with immense losses. Among them were the stories of people like Clara Jensen, a school teacher from Copenhagen, who had invested her savings in Terra, hoping to secure a future for her young daughter. Her story resonated with many, highlighting the deeply personal impacts of this financial catastrophe. The investigation was spearheaded by regulatory bodies from around the globe, each with a distinct mandate but a shared goal: to uncover the truth behind the collapse. In the United States, the Securities and Exchange Commission (SEC) took a leading role, examining whether Terraform Labs had misled investors. Meanwhile, in South Korea, the Financial Services Commission scrutinized the regulatory compliance of the company and its founders, Kwon and Daniel Shin. South Korea had a vested interest, not just because Kwon was a native son, born in Seoul in 1991, but because Terra was hailed as a national success story before its abrupt downfall. The investigation there was personal and urgent, driven by both pride and a sense of betrayal. As investigators delved into the intricate web of transactions and communications, several red flags emerged. Questions arose regarding the algorithmic stability mechanisms that underpinned Terra and Luna. Experts had long warned of the potential flaws in the algorithm, which were designed to maintain the peg of Terra's stablecoin to the US dollar. Among these experts was Dr. Helena Thorne, a respected economist who had sounded alarms about the inherent risks within Terra's model. Her warnings, issued in a paper published in late 2021, were largely ignored in the euphoric rush of Terra's rising value. Now her insights were being revisited with a sense of urgency and regret. The investigation also aimed to trace the flow of funds leading up to and following the collapse. Blockchain, with its promise of transparency, offered a trail of breadcrumbs. Yet, the complexity of transactions and the use of anonymous wallets posed challenges. Regulators employed advanced forensic techniques to untangle this web, seeking to understand whether any illegal activities had contributed to the loss of investor funds. Kwon, at the center of this storm, maintained a public profile of calm determination. His responses to the mounting scrutiny were measured but firm, often delivered through social media channels. However, behind the scenes, pressure was mounting. Internal communications within Terraform Labs, now made public through the investigation, suggested a different narrative. Emails and messages revealed moments of doubt, heated discussions, and attempts to stabilize the situation as Terra's value began to plummet. One particular message from May 8, 2022, captured the frantic atmosphere within the company. It was a brief exchange between Kwon and a senior engineer, outlining desperate measures to restore confidence in the ecosystem. "We need solutions, not excuses," Kwon wrote, encapsulating the tension and urgency of those final days. Outside the corporate realm, the investigation also touched on the broader implications for the cryptocurrency world. Terra's collapse had sent shockwaves through the market, triggering a domino effect that led to losses in other digital assets. Investors and analysts alike were forced to reevaluate the assumptions that had driven the cryptocurrency boom. In Silicon Valley, where Terra had been lauded as a pioneering force, the mood was one of reflection and reevaluation. Venture capitalists who had poured millions into Terraform Labs were now grappling with the ramifications of their bets. For some, it was a stark reminder of the volatility inherent in technological innovation and the need for rigorous scrutiny and due diligence. Yet amidst the turmoil, there were lessons being learned. The collapse of Terra was prompting a broader discourse on the future of finance, innovation, and regulation. It was a wake-up call for policymakers and innovators alike, underscoring the need for a balanced approach that encourages innovation while safeguarding the interests of the public. For Kwon, the path ahead was uncertain. As the investigation deepened, the narrative of his life was being rewritten, intertwining his personal ambitions with the broader story of technological risk and reward. Born in 1991, he had risen to prominence through his vision and tenacity, but now faced a future clouded by scrutiny and doubt. As 2022 gave way to 2023, the investigation continued to unfold. Each new piece of evidence added depth to the understanding of what had transpired, painting a picture that was both complex and deeply human. The investigators, driven by a commitment to uncover the truth, were systematically piecing together the events that led to one of the most significant financial collapses in recent memory. The world was watching, waiting for answers that might offer closure to those affected and chart a course for the future of the cryptocurrency industry. The story of Terra and Kwon was far from over, its lessons yet to be fully understood and its consequences still unfolding. In this landscape of uncertainty and discovery, the investigation served as a beacon, illuminating the path forward while reflecting on the past. It was a reminder that every innovation carries with it the seeds of challenge and opportunity, intertwined in the fabric of human endeavor. And so, with each revelation, the investigation moved forward, bridging the gap between the chaos of May 2022 and the promise of what might come next. As the narrative of Terra's collapse continued to unfold, it was clear that the journey was just beginning. The next chapter awaited, filled with the potential for understanding, redemption, and transformation. The next chapter awaited, filled with the potential for understanding, redemption, and transformation. As the dust settled on the chaotic collapse of Terra, questions lingered about what the future would entail for Kwon and the remnants of his ambitious project. The cryptocurrency world was left grappling with the aftermath, searching for lessons and a semblance of clarity in the wreckage. While the immediate financial losses were undeniable, the legacy of Terra reached beyond numbers and charts. It was a cautionary tale of unchecked ambition, technological innovation, and the inherent risks of a rapidly evolving financial landscape. In the months following the collapse, investigative reports, academic analyses, and public discourse began to piece together the broader implications of Terra's downfall. Kwon, once a beloved figure in tech circles, became a lightning rod for criticism. Born in Seoul in 1991, his journey from a young computer science student at Stanford University to the helm of a multi-billion-dollar enterprise was extraordinary. Yet it was also emblematic of the breakneck speed at which the cryptocurrency world moved. His story was not just about personal ambition, it was about the collective drive to revolutionize the financial system. The collapse of Terra in May 2022 was a seismic event, marking a crucial moment of reckoning for cryptocurrency investors, regulators, and developers alike. With a $40 billion loss in just 7 days, the implications reverberated across the globe, from Seoul to Silicon Valley. This collapse challenged the very notion of trust in algorithmic stability that underpinned the value of stablecoins like Terra. Stablecoins, pegged to traditional currencies like the US dollar, were seen as a bridge between the conventional financial world and the new era of decentralized finance. Terra was designed to provide stability in an otherwise volatile market, with Luna acting as a buffer to absorb market fluctuations. However, the events of May 2022 revealed the vulnerabilities inherent in these complex systems. For Kwon, the fallout was both public and personal. At 30 years old, he found himself at a crossroads, facing the repercussions of his actions and decisions. In the wake of the collapse, he sought to address the concerns of investors, many of whom were left with shattered dreams and financial ruin. His response was a mixture of defiance and introspection, acknowledging mistakes while also defending the core vision that had driven him. Public trust in Kwon and Terraform Labs wavered, yet some supporters remained, drawn to the potential for innovation and redemption. The cryptocurrency community, known for its resilience and adaptability, began to reassess its priorities and strategies. The collapse of Terra served as a catalyst for renewed discussions on regulation, transparency, and the ethical responsibilities of technology leaders. Historically, financial crashes have often led to significant shifts in industry practices and government policies. The 1929 stock market crash in the United States prompted the creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission to regulate financial markets and protect investors. Similarly, the 2008 financial crisis resulted in sweeping reforms, including the Dodd-Frank Act, aimed at preventing future collapses. The Terra collapse, though rooted in the digital realm, echoed these past events in its impact and potential for reform. Policymakers around the world began to scrutinize the cryptocurrency market with renewed vigor, recognizing the need to strike a balance between fostering innovation and ensuring stability. In this context, Terra became more than just a failed project. It became a symbol of the growing pains of a nascent industry. For individuals like Clara Kim, a software engineer from San Francisco, the collapse was deeply personal. She had invested her savings into Terra, drawn by its promise and potential. The loss was not just financial, but emotional, challenging her belief in the future of decentralized finance. Clara's story was one of many, reflecting the human cost of an industry that often prioritizes innovation over caution. As the world watched, Kwon faced the task of rebuilding trust and credibility. His journey was not solely about restoring financial stability, but also about acknowledging the broader impact of his actions. He engaged with critics and supporters alike, striving to understand the complexities and consequences of his vision. This reflection became an integral part of his legacy, shaping the narrative for future endeavors. In academia, Terra's collapse became a case study in the unpredictability and volatility of cryptocurrency markets. Scholars from institutions like the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Stanford University began researching the implications for economic theory and practice. The findings highlighted the need for robust risk management strategies and the importance of transparency in digital finance. The story of Terra and Kwon was evolving, bridging the gap between innovation and regulation, ambition and accountability. It was a narrative that continued to unfold, with lessons that resonated beyond the confines of the cryptocurrency world. As stakeholders grappled with the complexities of this new financial frontier, the legacy of Terra became a touchstone for future innovations and challenges. For Kwon, the path forward was uncertain, marked by both opportunities and obstacles. Yet, his story was far from over, with each chapter holding the promise of growth and transformation. The world watched as he navigated this complex landscape, eager to understand the full scope of his legacy. And so the next chapter awaited, filled with the potential for new beginnings and the enduring pursuit of a better future. As we draw this story to a gentle close, let's pause and reflect on what the rise and fall of Terra and Kwon reveal about human nature, money, trust, and technology. Throughout history, the allure of innovation has been both a beacon of hope and a warning. Visionary ideas propel us forward, but they also remind us of the inherent risks that accompany uncharted paths. The story of Terra is a reflection of our collective aspiration, a testament to humanity's enduring desire to reshape the world through ingenuity. Yet, it is also a reminder of the fragility that lies beneath the surface of even the most promising dreams. In May 2022, the collapse of Terra marked a pivotal moment. $40 billion vanished in a span of just 7 days, illustrating the volatility of a burgeoning market. The dream of a decentralized financial future was compelling, a world unbound by traditional constraints. However, the same qualities that made Terra appealing also made it vulnerable. Trust, once broken, can unravel swiftly, leaving profound impacts on the landscape of progress. The story of Kwon and Terra extends beyond technical and financial mechanics. It is a deeply human narrative. It speaks to our quest for certainty amidst uncertainty. The power of conviction can be magnetic, swaying even the most cautious among us. When certainty lacks humility, it transforms into a precarious force, overshadowing the need for critical thought. Those who invested were not driven by mere greed, but rather by the allure of innovation and the promise of a better future. Ultimately, the aftermath of Terra's collapse is not measured solely in financial loss, but in the lessons it imparts. It urges us to reconsider the foundations on which we build trust and to approach innovation with a blend of hope and skepticism. As the worlds of finance and technology continue to evolve, the narrative of Terra stands as a reminder of the vigilance required to navigate these complex terrains. As you settle into rest, let the echoes of this story gently recede. Let them remind you of the delicate balance between ambition and caution. Allow your thoughts to drift softly, carried by the quiet understanding that each ending holds the seed of a new beginning. Good night.